This video was brought to you by the generosity of my supporters on Ko-fi. Thank you for supporting the channel.
Hello, my lovelies. My name is Gilbert Dolthalion, and the plan for today is to show you a couple of early medieval embroidery stitches, a plait stitch, a loop stitch, and a raised plait stitch. These stitches aren't really used very much anymore. I haven't really seen them in any modern embroidery stitches, but they make a really interesting pattern and they were used historically to reinforce seams and hems, so they've got a practical use as well as a decorative one. It should be noted at this point that these names aren't set in stone. During my research I found the same piece being described with different names and with different stitches being given as what the stitch could be. As always with archaeological finds where we've only got pieces, it's very much down to interpretation, and these are my interpretation based on the research that others have done and the pieces themselves. Specifically, there aren't any written primary sources for these, so we don't have the names that they were given in the past, if indeed they even had them. What we do have are tiny fragments that have been found, and the interpretation of other archaeologists. So for this video I'm using the names that were used by the person who came up with the interpretation that I'm showing you today. But I've also linked my research down below so you can have a look at it and develop your own ideas as well. So it seems that this type of embroidery stitch were done freehand, so that would be without a frame. However, for this video I am going to be using a frame just because it makes it a lot easier to film the stitches and it makes it easier for you to see what I'm doing. Historically it would have been done without the frame, so if you want to go for accuracy then do it without. If you want to make life a bit easier while you're learning to do them, then I do recommend using a frame if you have one. Some of the examples we have use matching threads and some of them use contrasting ones, so if you want to go for something eye-catching there's nothing wrong with doing that. For this I've gone for bright colours that are not naturally dyed at all, but will hopefully show up well on camera for you. I'm also using modern embroidery floss, again to make things easier to see, but it actually makes things harder because I'm trying to keep the strands together. A yarn or a silk thread would have been used back in the day, along with possibly some metallic threads too. And if you do single strands, you will find it much easier to see where you're weaving the thread through. But with all of that out of the way, let's get to some stitching.
The first stitch came from a headdress from Dokkum in the Netherlands and was used to secure the seam allowance down, so it's slightly different than the other two in that it wasn't on what we assume is the outside of the piece. It's called a plait stitch in the document I was looking at, but it's the most basic form of the stitch, so we're going to start here. First step is to make yourself a securing loop at the top. It's tempting to leave this loose, but trust me, that'll end up just pulling your first stitches out of place. Give it enough space that you can get the needle under it, but still pull the thread through completely. Your first stitch needs to come down from one side, slightly across and slightly down. Pull your thread through, cross it over your securing loop so that you're coming in from the opposite side, thread it through to form your first loop, and then come back down into the material on the opposite side to where you started, another step down from where you first entered the fabric. That's your first stitch done. The second one comes through directly opposite where you just left the fabric, underneath the first stitch's entry point, come out, cross it over, pass the needle under the loop that you just made, and exit the fabric on the opposite side, a step down from the last exit point. And from there on, it's just repeating that. In opposite the exit point, up and over the loop, cross over and come out a step down from the last one. I actually find it easier to do the stitch upside down, So my stitches are going up the fabric rather than down, but play around with it and find what position works best for you. You can also draw yourself 2 parallel lines to start with and mark each stitch on them. That will help you get used to the rhythm of it. When I started, I did each stitch 5mm down, with the first stitch being 2.5mm down. The second stitch comes from examples from Dublin and Sutton Hoo. This one I found called the loop stitch, but it really is again the same basic stitch built up. You start again with a securing loop. You're going to need to get 2 threads through it, so make it a little bit bigger than the last one, but as with the last time, still tighten it so that it doesn't pull forward when you start. The first stitch is exactly the same. Start on the right, just underneath and to the side of your securing loop. Bring it up and cross it over so you're entering on the opposite side. Bring it back over and exit the fabric on the opposite side, a step down from your entering stitch. Then bring it back out parallel to that exit stitch, but this time cross over and go through this loop a second time. This time when you cross over, go under the thread you've just pulled through so that the entrance side is on top of the exit side. Then exit the thread underneath the first exit point, again a step down. Now enter the fabric parallel to your last exit stitch again and bring it up. Pass it through the loop that you just made, once again going underneath itself. You should be passing under 2 threads on the exit side, under the last entrance thread, and then over your current thread. Then pull that taut and once again exit on the opposite side a step down. And then it's just repeating again. Enter the fabric parallel, cross over and pass through the loop. Go under your current thread, and then come back out on the opposite side a step downwards. And now that you're used to a slightly more complex version, let's try the final boss, the raised plait stitch, after this quick commercial break. So this stitch was found on the same headdress that the first plait stitch was found on, along with a couple of hats found in other places in the Netherlands. Unlike that first stitch, it was on the outside over the top of the seam. And if it looks a bit complicated from the sketch, yes, it is a bit, but like with the others, once you've had a couple of goes at it, you'll pick it up. Once again, we're starting with a securing loop, then starting on one side, crossing over and passing through, then exiting on the opposite side a step down. Repeat that again. And then once more, so you've been through the securing loop 3 times, but leave the end of the last stitch loose so you'll have space to get the needle under it. Now we're ready to really start. As before, come out parallel to your last stitch. This time you want to pass under that last stitch, then count up 3 stitches on both sides and pass under, looping the loose thread of the last stitch under the needle again, so that your thread ends up going under the last stitch, over the 2 stitches before that, before crossing over. Then on the other side, it goes over the 2 stitches and weaves under the last stitch again, forming the plait. Then you exit the fabric on the far side, as always a step down. It's a little bit complicated, so let's go through that again. Come up parallel, go under the last stitch, count 3 stitches up on both sides and pass your needle under there, loop it over the last stitch, then come over and exit again half a step down. Up on the right side, under the last stitch, three stitches up, pass under, loop through again, cross over and come back down. This one is a little bit more complicated and you do want to pay attention That complicated weave is what makes the pattern. But as with most embroidery stitches, the more you practice, the easier it becomes, and after a while you'll find yourself doing it without having to think anymore. And I will say that there are plenty of different ways to interpret these. I found several while trying to work these out that all work perfectly well and create interesting patterns of your own. So even if you don't manage to recreate this one, I'm sure you'll find a way of doing it that leaves with an interesting stitch. And once you've got the hang of it, the world is your oyster, or at least your extra fancy medieval seams are.
So that's looped and plaited stitches. They're both pretty firmly Northern European stitches. I couldn't find any record of them being found anywhere else. There's also a very interesting theory that they were an Anglo-Saxon stitch based on where they were first found, that was then exported to Scandinavia and fell out of use in Christian parts of the world, before finally being reintroduced to the UK by the Vikings. Given how few examples we have of it, I'm pretty wary about that. Yes, there is a 200-year gap where we haven't found any pieces in the UK, but with so few examples, that 200-year gap could just mean that we haven't found any. Lack of evidence is not evidence. But I do like the idea that the interweaving parts of the stitch could have had an association with paganism and perhaps even amuletic properties, but there is no evidence for it. There certainly is a similarity between them and things like knotwork and Anglo-Saxon beast motifs, but you would need to see some actual link to be able to make that connection, I think. But whatever the meaning or lack thereof of these stitches, they're fun to do, and they add a really interesting touch to a seam as well as making it much more hard wearing. So enjoy and go forth and find something nice to embellish. Thank you again for watching through to the end, and as always, a huge thank you to all of my lovely subscribers and all of my incredibly generous coffee donators. If you enjoyed this or found it helpful, please think about giving me a like or subscribing if you're not already for more costume and sewing related content, or donating to my coffee if you're able. Stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you again soon. Bye! And the interpretation that other archaeologists and the research that other archaeologists apparently